There are places in the world that swallow people quietly, without violence, without witness, without explanation. The Yukon is one of them. It does not announce itself as dangerous. It simply continues, indifferent, while the people who enter it sometimes do not. In the summer of 1953, a government surveyor named Ronald Janssen packed his equipment, saddled his horse, and rode north into the interior of Canada's Yukon territory on an assignment so routine it barely warranted a second signature on the dispatch form. The timber concession along the boundary line had been contested between two logging companies for the better part of a decade, and someone needed to walk the ground and confirm where one man's land ended and another's began. That someone was Janssen. He had done it dozens of times before. The Canadian government's Department of Mines and Technical Surveys maintained a small seasonal base at Destruction Bay, a narrow settlement pressed against the shore of Kluone Lake where the Alaska Highway ran gray and straight through the surrounding emptiness. It was from here that Janssen departed on the morning of June 14, 1953, with 10 days of supplies, a set of boundary coordinates, and a field notebook already broken in from previous seasons. The base supervisor, a man named Harold Crew, noted the departure in the station log with a single line and an estimated return date of June 24th. The route Janssen was assigned to follow was not unknown terrain. Survey teams had passed through portions of it in the late 1940s during the broader post-war mapping effort, and rough trail markers still existed along the lower ridgeline. His task was to walk the northern boundary of Concession 7C, verify the existing stone cairns, note any displacement or erosion, and return. It was methodical work. It was the kind of work that required patience more than skill, and Janssen had both in steady supply. His field notes from the first 5 days were exactly what the department would have expected. Coordinates recorded in clean columns. Cairn conditions assessed in brief, professional language. Weather observations logged each morning. The handwriting was unhurried. The entries were precise. There was nothing in those first pages to suggest anything other than a man doing his job in quiet, competent solitude, moving through the landscape at a steady pace and sleeping well enough to rise early and continue. On day 3, he noted the trail markers becoming harder to follow past a certain elevation, which he attributed to winter snowpack damage. He adjusted his route slightly westward and recorded the deviation without apparent concern. On day 4, he mentioned the temperature dropping unexpectedly overnight, enough to frost the ground by morning. Unusual for mid-June, but not unheard of at that altitude. He made a note to check his compass more frequently, as he had begun to suspect minor magnetic variation in the area, a known phenomenon in parts of the Yukon interior where subsurface mineral deposits could affect readings by several degrees. The horse, a brown gelding the base referred to simply as Miller, was by all accounts a reliable animal. Crew had assigned it to survey parties before, and noted in his own records that it was calm under difficult conditions and sensible enough not to panic at weather. Janssen had worked with Miller on at least one previous assignment and raised no concerns about the pairing. When Miller appeared at the edge of the base camp on the morning of June 22nd, 2 days before Janssen's expected return, Crew stepped outside and assumed at first that Janssen had come back early. Miller was saddled. The saddlebags were still fastened and appeared fully loaded. The bedroll was tied behind the saddle exactly as it would have been packed for travel. There was no blood on the animal, no visible injury, no sign of distress beyond the fact that it had arrived alone and stood at the camp perimeter as though waiting for someone to take its reins. Crew walked the full perimeter of the camp looking for Janssen, called his name twice into the tree line, and received nothing in return but the sound of the lake moving against the rocks below. Crew waited until the following morning before sending word to Whitehorse. He noted in his log that he had hoped Janssen might have simply lost the horse and was continuing on foot, and that a day's patience seemed reasonable before escalating. By the time a small search party was assembled and reached the base at Destruction Bay, it was June 25th. Janssen had now been out of contact for what was calculated to be at least 4 days, and possibly longer depending on when exactly Miller had separated from him.
Stop transcription here.
The search party followed Miller's probable back trail as best they could, reading the ground for hoof impressions in the softer soil along the lower ridge. They found the campsite on the afternoon of the second search day, tucked into a shallow hollow below the tree line where the ground was level and a creek ran close enough to provide water. The site was orderly. The fire ring held ash that had long gone cold. The food tin was open on a flat stone beside it, half its contents remaining. The bedroll was not present, which suggested it had still been on the horse when Miller left, or that Janssen had packed it before departing on whatever errand had taken him away from camp. The field notebook was there. It was sitting on top of the supply pack, weighted down by a small flat stone to keep it from shifting in the wind. The search party leader, a territorial officer named Douglas Marsh, picked it up and paged through it carefully. The entries ran through the morning of June 19th, day 6 of the survey. They were consistent with everything that had preceded them. Coordinate logs, cairn assessments, a brief weather note. The final line of the final entry was a compass bearing, written in Janssen's usual clean hand, followed by a single word on the same line with no punctuation after it. The word was, again. Marsh read it twice. He showed it to the man beside him, who read it and said nothing. Neither of them could determine with certainty whether the word referred to something Janssen had seen, something he had done, or something he had intended to write more about, and had not. It sat at the end of his last recorded thought like a door left open onto an empty room. The search party noted it in their report and continued looking. They found no footprints leading away from camp in any direction that held for more than a short distance before the ground became too rocky to read. They found no broken branches, no displaced stones, no indication of a fall or a struggle. The creek showed nothing. The surrounding terrain was examined in a radius of roughly half a mile before the search was called back by weather moving in from the northwest, low cloud, and the beginning of rain that would erase whatever the ground might still have been holding. They returned to the campsite once more before withdrawing, and Marsh stood in the center of it for a long moment, looking at the cold fire ring, the open tin, the flat stone that had held the notebook. Everything about the site communicated interruption rather than departure. A man had been here, working, eating, sleeping, moving through his days with order and purpose. And then at some point between the morning of June 19th and the moment Miller arrived at Destruction Bay alone, that order had simply ended without visible cause. The search was officially stopped on July 3rd, 1953, 9 days after it started. The official report said the search stopped because of bad weather and because they had checked all ground areas. A note added to the order said that planes would look for the person later when resources were ready. There is no record that the planes ever searched. The file moved from active to pending and then to archived in the following months without any notes about the search starting again or changing status. Douglas Marsh filed his report to the White Horse Territorial Office on July 7th. It was a careful document, written in the measured language of a man who understood that his job was to record what he found and not speculate beyond it. He described the campsite, the notebook, the horse's condition, the search parameters, and the terrain. He noted the word at the end of the final entry without interpretation, identifying it only as an anomaly in the otherwise consistent record. His conclusion stated that no determination of cause could be made from available evidence, and that the matter was referred to the department for further action at their discretion. The Department of Mines and Technical Surveys acknowledged receipt of the report on July 14th. What followed in the archive is a gap of almost 4 months, a stretch of silence in the file where one might expect follow-up correspondence, requests for additional information, or at minimum a notation that the matter was under review. The next document in Janssen's personnel file is dated November 2nd, 1953. It is a single administrative form closing his employment record. The cause of departure line reads, circumstances undetermined. No next of kin notification record is attached, though Janssen's intake form from 1948 lists a sister in Vancouver. The timber concession itself, Concession 7C, was reassigned in the spring of 1954. The new holder was a logging operation out of British Columbia that had no prior presence in the Yukon interior. The reassignment was processed without public notice, as most concession transfers of that period were, and the survey work Janssen had been sent to complete was eventually finished by a two-man team the following summer. Their report made no reference to the previous survey attempt or to Janssen by name. The boundary markers were confirmed, the concession was certified, and the paperwork was filed in the same archive system that held the closed personnel file, several drawers away and entirely uncross-referenced. What survives of Janssen's record outside the government archive is thin. A brief mention in a 1954 issue of a Whitehorse community paper lists him among several individuals reported missing in the territory during the previous year, in a column that also includes a trapper last seen near the Pelly River and a prospector who had failed to return from a solo claim inspection. The column is factual and brief. It notes that searches were conducted and that no remains were found. It does not describe the campsite or the notebook. It reads the way official silences often read, not as concealment exactly, but as the natural settling of institutional attention onto the next thing. Harold Crew remained at the Destruction Bay base through the 1954 season and left the department's employ in early 1955. A short letter he wrote to a colleague in the Ottawa mapping office, discovered decades later in a private collection of departmental correspondence, mentions Janssen once, in passing, near the end of a paragraph about the difficulties of maintaining accurate personnel records in remote postings. Crew wrote that he had never been fully comfortable with the way the file had been handled, not because he suspected wrongdoing, but because the ordinary machinery of bureaucratic closure had moved too quickly over something that had not felt ordinary to the people who were there. He did not elaborate. The letter moved on to other subjects. Miller, the horse, was reassigned to another survey party in July of 1953 and appears in base records through the following 2 seasons without incident. There is something in that detail that tends to stay with people who look into the case. The animal's complete and unremarkable continuation, assigned to new work, noted in new logs, while the man who had ridden him into the interior remained listed only as circumstances undetermined. Horses do not carry explanations back with them. They carry only what was loaded onto them, and whatever Janssen had known or seen or written after his last notebook entry, Miller had brought none of it home. The terrain around the survey area has changed in the decades since. The lower ridgeline trails are overgrown now. The old marker cairns either collapsed or absorbed into the general disorder of the landscape. The creek that ran beside Janssen's campsite still runs, though its precise location, relative to the hollow he chose, is difficult to establish from the search party's written description alone. The Yukon has a way of reclaiming the evidence of human presence with a patience that outlasts any institutional memory, and by the time anyone might have thought to go back and look more carefully, the ground itself had moved on. There were, over the years, occasional informal attempts to trace what had happened. A historian working on a broader study of post-war surveying in the Canadian North came across Janssen's file in the early 1980s and spent several weeks trying to reconstruct his route from the notebook entries and the search party report. He was able to place the campsite with reasonable confidence on a modern topographic map, and noted that the area Janssen appeared to have been working toward on the morning of June 19th was a shallow valley system that the 1940s survey teams had mapped only partially, leaving the interior of it as estimated rather than observed terrain. The historian noted this in a footnote and did not pursue it further, as it fell outside the scope of his primary research. The compass bearing written before the word again pointed, when plotted against the campsite's likely position, in the direction of that same valley. This is not a conclusion. It is a detail, the kind that accumulates around cases like this one without resolving anything, that points somewhere without arriving. Marsh had noted the bearing in his report, but had not been able to search the valley due to weather. Whether any subsequent party ever reached it is not recorded. The valley appears on current maps under a designation that suggests it was formally surveyed at some point after 1955, but the survey records from that effort, if they exist, have not been located in the publicly accessible archive. Janssen's sister in Vancouver, if she was ever officially notified of her brother's disappearance and the closure of his file, left no documented response. There is no letter of inquiry from her in the departmental records, no request for information, no formal correspondence of any kind. This could mean many things. It could mean the notification was made verbally, or that she accepted the outcome without pressing for detail, or that she was never properly reached at all. It could mean the address on the intake form was out of date by 1953. The absence of her voice in the record is not itself significant, but it adds to the quality of the file as a whole, the sense of a life that ended at the edge of documentation and simply stayed there. What the file does not contain is as telling as what it does. There is no inquest, there is no coroner's report, which would be expected only if remains had been found, and they were not. There is no formal board of inquiry into the circumstances of a government employee's disappearance while on active assignment, which might have been expected given the nature of his work and the conditions of his deployment. There is no record of the department reviewing its protocols for solo survey assignments in remote terrain following the incident, though such a review would have been standard practice in most equivalent cases from the period. The file is thin, not because it was purged, but because it was never fully written to begin with. The question that tends to surface last, after all the administrative details have been examined and set aside, is the simplest one. What had Janssen seen before? The word again implies a return, a repetition, something encountered more than once. But his notebook entries in the days preceding that final morning contain nothing that reads as unusual. The compass variation he noted on day 4, the unexpected frost, the trail markers thinning past the upper elevation. These are the observations of a careful man moving through familiar professional territory, and none of them suggest he was building toward something, or that something was building toward him. Unless the notebook was not the only place he was recording things. Survey teams of that period sometimes kept a secondary log, informal, personal, separate from the official field notes that would be submitted to the department on return. There is no reference to a second notebook in the search party's inventory of the campsite. But the inventory is brief, and Marsh's report acknowledges that the site was examined under time pressure before the weather closed in. A small personal journal, tucked into a jacket pocket or a saddlebag already taken by the horse, would not necessarily have been found, and would not necessarily have been listed as missing if no one knew to look for it. Miller had arrived at Destruction Bay with the saddlebags still fastened. Crew noted their contents in his log as survey equipment and personal provisions, consistent with what Janssen had departed with. There is no itemized list. The word consistent is doing a great deal of work in that single sentence, and it is the kind of word that appears in records when the person writing them is describing something quickly, from memory, without laying every object out and counting it against a departure manifest. Whether a secondary notebook was among the contents of those bags, examined and then quietly set aside, or whether it was never there at all, cannot be determined from what the record provides. The valley that the compass bearing pointed toward was designated in post-war mapping as a low drainage basin with seasonal water and no permanent features of note. The partial survey from the 1940s had approached it from the south and turned back before reaching the interior, citing difficult terrain and time constraints. Whatever sits at the center of that basin, if anything, was not formally described in any document available through the public archive. The historian who traced Janssen's route in the 1980s wrote in his footnote that the valley was, in his estimation, the kind of place that accumulates omissions, not through any deliberate effort, but simply because no one had yet found a reason important enough to finish the job of looking at it. There are cases that remain open because the evidence was destroyed, and cases that remain open because the investigation was inadequate, and cases that remain open because the truth of what happened was simply never recoverable from the start. Janssen's case has the texture of the third kind. A man walked into a landscape that keeps its own records in rock and weather and the slow movement of water, and whatever those records contain has not been translated into any language the archive can read. The campsite is gone now, absorbed back into the ground. The creek still runs. The valley is still there, partially mapped, its interior still carrying that old designation of estimated rather than observed. Ronald Janssen would have been in his mid-30s in 1953, based on his department intake form. He had worked for the survey division for 5 years, without a formal complaint or commendation in his file. The kind of record that belongs to a man who did his work steadily and without incident and expected to continue doing so. He had a sister in Vancouver. He had a horse that knew its way home. He had a notebook that he filled with careful, unhurried entries until the morning of June 19th, and then he had one word left to write, and after that, nothing at all. The file was last accessed, according to the archive's internal log, in 1987. The access notation does not identify who requested it or why. After that, there is no further record of the file being opened, cross-referenced, or flagged for review. It sits in the archive the way all such files eventually sit, not hidden, not destroyed, simply present in a place where presence and invisibility amount to the same thing. Anyone with the right access and enough patience could find it. The question is whether finding it would change anything, or whether the file has already said everything it is capable of saying, which is only that a man went out and did not come back, and that the word he left behind meant something to him that it has not yet managed to mean to anyone else. The Yukon interior looks the same in summer as it must have looked in June of 1953. The ridgelines hold their shape against the sky. The creek water is cold enough to ache. Somewhere north of Destruction Bay, past the elevation where the trail markers run out and the compass begins to drift by degrees that a careful man would notice and record, there is a valley that has been estimated but not observed. And whatever Janssen found there, or found there again, the landscape has not offered it back. Some disappearances leave behind wreckage. Some leave behind silence. Ronald Janssen left behind a campsite that looked like he was coming back, a horse that knew the way home, and a single word that has never been adequately explained. The file is closed. The ground is not.